There's a pain so devastating that it doesn't just break your heart, it shatters your reality. Picture this. You're 7 years old, and the person who's supposed to keep you safe becomes the source of your terror. Or you're 35, and the partner you trusted with your deepest secrets uses them as weapons against you. Maybe you're 15, and the parent who should believe in you becomes your harshest critic, the one who makes you feel like you're fundamentally flawed. This isn't just pain. This is betrayal trauma. When those closest to us become our executioners, something dies inside that goes far beyond trust. It's the death of innocence, yes, but it's something even more profound. It's the collapse of our fundamental understanding of how the world works. Because betrayal doesn't just wound us, it rewrites the very code of our existence. The psychology textbooks will tell you about betrayal trauma as if it's just another disorder to be catalogued and treated. They'll give you statistics, diagnostic criteria, treatment protocols. But they're missing something crucial, something that Carl Jung understood decades before modern psychology caught up, something that Friedrich Nietzsche saw with terrifying clarity. They're missing the fact that betrayal trauma isn't just something that happens to you. It's something that happens through you. It's not just a wound to be healed, it's a doorway to be walked through. But here's what no one wants to tell you about that doorway. Here's the truth they don't put in the self-help books or the therapy manuals. Walking through that door requires you to die first, not physically but psychologically. Everything you thought you knew about yourself, about others, about the nature of reality itself has to be torn down before anything real can be built in its place. Most people spend their entire lives running from this death. They numb themselves with substances, with relationships, with work, with anything that will help them forget the moment their world collapsed. They build elaborate defenses, create false selves, develop what Jung called complexes, these autonomous psychological entities that take over their lives without them even realizing it. But what if I told you that the very wound you're trying so desperately to heal might be the most sacred thing about you? What if the betrayal that destroyed your old world was actually the violent birth of your true self trying to emerge? What if the pain you carry isn't a burden to be dropped, but a teacher you haven't learned to listen to yet? Jung spent his life studying these dark corners of the human psyche. He discovered that our greatest wounds become our greatest sources of unconscious power. Not the kind of power that dominates others, but the kind that transforms lead into gold, darkness into light, trauma into wisdom. Nietzsche went even further. He saw betrayal as the necessary destruction of all our comfortable illusions, the death of everything we cling to for security, including our concept of God, of meaning, of purpose itself. For him, this wasn't a tragedy to be avoided. It was the birth canal of authentic existence. Both men understood something that modern psychology is only beginning to grasp. The wound isn't the problem. Running from the wound is the problem. But running toward it, that's where things get interesting. That's where the real work begins. Because when you stop trying to heal from betrayal trauma and start learning from it, something extraordinary happens. The victim becomes the initiate. The wounded becomes the wounded healer. The broken becomes the breakthrough. You see, there's a secret hidden in the heart of every betrayal, and most people will never discover it because they're too busy trying to forget it ever happened. They're too focused on getting back to who they were before the betrayal, not realizing that who they were before was exactly what made them vulnerable to betrayal in the first place. The secret is this: betrayal trauma isn't random. It's not something that just happens to unlucky people. It's an initiation, a violent, unwelcome, absolutely necessary initiation into a deeper understanding of yourself and the world around you. And the most beautiful, terrifying part? You don't get to choose whether or not you accept this initiation. The moment someone you trusted betrayed that trust, the process already began. The only choice you have is whether you'll remain unconscious to it, spending your life as a victim of forces you don't understand, or whether you'll wake up to what's really happening and claim your power as the author of your own transformation. Jung called this process individuation. Nietzsche called it becoming who you are. Both knew it required facing the darkness within and without. Both understood that the path to wholeness runs directly through the heart of our deepest wounds. So let me ask you something. Are you ready to stop running from your betrayal trauma and start running toward the truth it's trying to show you? Are you ready to discover what lies on the other side of the wound that refuses to heal? Because what's waiting there might just be the most authentic version of yourself you've ever encountered. To understand why betrayal cuts so deep, we need to dissect it. We need to look at what makes betrayal trauma fundamentally different from every other kind of psychological wound. Think about ordinary trauma for a moment. A car accident, a natural disaster, a random act of violence from a stranger. These events are devastating, yes, but they don't challenge your fundamental understanding of how relationships work. They don't make you question whether love itself is real or whether trust is just a beautiful delusion. Betrayal trauma is different. It's not just about what happened to you, it's about who did it. Dr. Jennifer Freyd, the psychologist who coined the term, discovered something that should terrify anyone who thinks they understand human psychology. She found that when the person who harms us is also the person we depend on for safety, love, or survival, our psychological system faces an impossible choice. Do we acknowledge the betrayal and risk losing the relationship we need to survive? Or do we deny the betrayal and sacrifice our own reality in the process? Most of us, especially as children, choose survival. We choose the relationship over reality. We gaslight ourselves before anyone else gets the chance. We tell ourselves it wasn't that bad, that we misunderstood, that we're being too sensitive, that they didn't mean it. This is where the real damage happens. Not in the original betrayal, but in the thousand small betrayals of ourselves that follow. Every time we choose someone else's version of reality over our own inner knowing, we fracture a little more. We become strangers to ourselves. But here's what gets even darker. This fracturing isn't just psychological, it's neurobiological. When betrayal trauma occurs, especially in childhood, it literally rewires our nervous system. Our brains learn that the people closest to us are also the most dangerous. They learn that love and pain are synonymous. They learn that to be seen is to be vulnerable, and to be vulnerable is to be destroyed. So we develop what therapists call hypervigilance. We become experts at reading micro-expressions, at detecting the slightest shift in someone's energy, at anticipating betrayal before it happens. We become human lie detectors, walking through the world with our nervous systems permanently activated, always scanning for the next threat. And the cruelest irony, this very hypervigilance, born from betrayal, often creates the conditions for more betrayal. Because when you're constantly expecting to be hurt, you attract people who will hurt you. When you're always waiting for the other shoe to drop, you tend to find people who are holding shoes. It's not your fault. It's not conscious. It's just that trauma has a gravitational pull. Unhealed wounds call to other unhealed wounds. Unconscious patterns repeat themselves with ruthless precision until someone becomes conscious enough to break the cycle. But there's something else happening here that modern psychology barely acknowledges, something that goes beyond neurobiology and attachment theory and all the clinical explanations that try to contain the mystery of human suffering. There's something almost archetypal about betrayal trauma, something that connects your personal wound to the deepest stories humanity has ever told itself. Think about it. Every mythology, every religion, every spiritual tradition has betrayal at its core. Judas betraying Christ, Brutus betraying Caesar, Lucifer betraying God, Adam and Eve betraying divine trust. These aren't just stories, they're maps. They're showing us something fundamental about the human condition, about the price of consciousness, about what it means to fall from grace. And maybe, just maybe, they're showing us something else. Maybe they're showing us that betrayal isn't a bug in the system of human relationships. Maybe it's a feature. Maybe it's how consciousness grows. Maybe it's how souls mature. Because when you really look at those mythological betrayals, something interesting emerges. The betrayal is never the end of the story. It's always the beginning of something greater. The crucifixion leads to resurrection. The fall leads to redemption. The wound leads to wisdom. But here's what the myths don't tell you, what you have to discover for yourself through lived experience. The transformation isn't automatic. The resurrection doesn't just happen because you suffered. The redemption isn't guaranteed just because you were wounded. There's something you have to do first. Something that requires more courage than most people possess. Something that goes against every instinct trauma has taught you. You have to stop trying to heal the wound and start trying to understand what it's trying to teach you. Because betrayal trauma isn't just random suffering inflicted by broken people on innocent victims. It's a curriculum, a brutal, unwelcome curriculum designed to teach you things about yourself and reality that you could never learn any other way. And the first lesson, the most important lesson, the lesson that will either liberate you or keep you trapped in victim consciousness for the rest of your life. You can't heal what you won't feel. You can't integrate what you won't acknowledge. You can't transform what you're still trying to escape from, but there's something even more unsettling that we need to explore. Something that Jung understood about these deep psychological wounds that modern therapy often misses completely. Carl Jung understood something about betrayal trauma that would make most modern therapists uncomfortable. He understood that these wounds don't just damage us, they possess us. Jung called them complexes, autonomous psychological entities that take up residence in our unconscious and begin living our lives for us without our permission or awareness. And the complexes born from betrayal trauma, they're the most powerful ones of all. Picture this. You're in a relationship, and your partner does something completely innocent. They forget to text you back. They have lunch with a friend without mentioning it. They seem distracted during a conversation. Suddenly, you're not responding as your adult self anymore. Something else has taken over. Something wounded, something terrified, something that operates from the assumption that betrayal is always just around the corner. That's not you reacting. That's your betrayal complex reacting. Jung discovered that when we experience trauma, especially relational trauma, we don't just store it as memory. We store it as a living, breathing psychological entity with its own agenda, its own worldview, its own way of interpreting reality. And that entity doesn't want to heal, it wants to survive, and it believes the only way to survive is to never be caught off guard again. So your betrayal complex becomes hyper-vigilant. It analyzes every conversation for hidden meanings. It looks for evidence that people are lying, that they're going to leave, that they're already planning their exit strategy. And here's the truly insidious part. It usually finds what it's looking for. Not because it's true, but because when you're looking for betrayal, everything starts to look like betrayal. Your partner's phone buzzes, and your complex interprets it as evidence of an affair. Your friend takes a few hours to respond to a message, and your complex decides they're pulling away. Your boss gives you constructive feedback, and your complex hears confirmation that you're worthless and about to be fired. The complex isn't trying to hurt you. In its twisted logic, it's trying to protect you. It's trying to make sure you're never blindsided by betrayal again. But in the process, it creates a self-fulfilling prophecy. It makes you so difficult to be in relationship with, so suspicious and reactive and defended, that people actually do start to pull away. And then the complex gets to say, "See? I told you they couldn't be trusted. I told you they would leave. Good thing I was watching out for you." Jung called this the autonomous nature of complexes. They don't just influence our behavior, they hijack our entire personality. When a complex is activated, it's as if we become temporarily possessed by a psychological entity that has its own memories, its own emotional responses, its own way of seeing the world. And the betrayal complex has one primary goal: never let anyone get close enough to hurt you that badly again. But Jung understood something even more profound about these complexes. He realized that they aren't just psychological wounds, they're also psychological opportunities. Every complex, no matter how destructive, contains within it a seed of unrealized potential. The betrayal complex, for all its destructive power, also contains incredible gifts. The hypervigilance it creates can become extraordinary intuition. The emotional intensity it generates can become profound empathy. The protective mechanisms it builds can become fierce boundaries. The pattern recognition it develops can become deep wisdom about human nature. But here's the catch. These gifts can only be accessed when you stop being unconsciously possessed by the complex and start consciously relating to it. Jung called this process making the unconscious conscious. It's the difference between being lived by your trauma and learning to live with it consciously. It's the difference between being a victim of your betrayal complex and becoming its wise and compassionate guardian. But this process requires something that most people aren't willing to do. It requires you to turn toward the complex instead of running from it. It requires you to dialogue with it, to understand its fears, to acknowledge its concerns, to appreciate its intentions, even while refusing to let it run your life. It's like having a conversation with the most terrified, most wounded part of yourself, the part that learned, often at a very young age, that the people who say they love you are the ones most likely to destroy you. The part that decided it would rather be alone forever than risk being betrayed again. And you have to speak to this part with infinite compassion because it has been carrying an impossible burden. It has been trying to keep you safe in a world that taught it that safety doesn't exist. It has been standing guard against a pain so devastating that it would rather create a life of isolation than risk experiencing it again. But Jung discovered something remarkable about this process of conscious dialogue with our complexes. He found that when we stop fighting them and start understanding them, they begin to transform. The energy that was locked up in defensive patterns becomes available for creative purposes. The sensitivity that was causing so much pain becomes a superpower for reading between the lines of human interaction. The betrayal complex doesn't disappear, but it stops running the show. It becomes an advisor instead of a dictator, a wise counselor who can warn you when something genuinely doesn't feel right, rather than a paranoid security guard who sees threats in every shadow. This is what Jung meant by integration. Not the elimination of our wounded parts, but the conscious relationship with them. Not the healing of our trauma, but the transformation of our trauma into wisdom. But Jung understood something else about betrayal trauma that cuts even deeper than psychological theory. He understood that these wounds connect us to something archetypal, something that goes beyond personal psychology into the realm of universal human experience. And this is where things get really interesting, because Jung realized that betrayal trauma doesn't just create complexes, it also creates what he called a compensatory reaction in the unconscious. The psyche, in its infinite wisdom, begins to constellate experiences and relationships that will force us to confront and integrate what we've been unconsciously carrying. In other words, your betrayal trauma doesn't just damage you, it also sets in motion a healing process that will continue to unfold throughout your entire life, often in ways you'll never consciously recognize. But here's what Jung discovered that was truly disturbing about this process. What Jung discovered was disturbing, but what Nietzsche understood about betrayal was absolutely terrifying. He understood that when someone you trust destroys that trust, they don't just betray you, they betray your entire belief system about how reality works. Nietzsche called it the death of God, but he wasn't just talking about religion, he was talking about the death of every comfortable illusion that makes life bearable, the death of the belief that good people exist, the death of the belief that love conquers all, the death of the belief that if you're a good person, good things will happen to you. When betrayal trauma strikes, it doesn't just wound you psychologically, it shatters your fundamental assumptions about the nature of existence itself. Think about the beliefs you held before your deepest betrayal. Maybe you believed that parents naturally protect their children. Maybe you believed that if you loved someone completely, they would never intentionally hurt you. Maybe you believed that people are basically good, that intentions matter, that honesty exists. Betrayal trauma doesn't just challenge these beliefs, it annihilates them. It forces you to confront the possibility that everything you thought you knew about human nature, about love, about safety, about meaning itself, might be nothing more than beautiful delusions. And this is where most people get stuck. They experience the death of their illusions, but they can't bear to live in a world without them. So they desperately try to resurrect the old beliefs, to find new people to project their fantasies onto, to rebuild the same house of cards that was just blown down. They become what Nietzsche called the last men, people who know their values are hollow, but can't imagine living without them. People who go through the motions of believing in love and trust and goodness, but deep down they know these things are just comforting stories we tell ourselves to avoid facing the abyss of meaninglessness. But Nietzsche saw something else. He saw that this death of illusions, as devastating as it is also the birth of something unprecedented. He saw that when you stop trying to resurrect your old beliefs and allow yourself to fully experience the void they leave behind, something extraordinary becomes possible. You become what he called a free spirit, someone who no longer needs external validation to feel worthy, someone who no longer needs guarantees of safety to take risks, someone who no longer needs the promise of meaning to create meaning. But here's what Nietzsche understood that most philosophers miss. The path from the death of God to the birth of the free spirit runs directly through what he called nihilism. And nihilism isn't a destination, it's a necessary passage. When betrayal trauma strikes, you don't just lose your specific beliefs about the person who betrayed you. You lose your faith in the possibility of trust itself. You lose your belief in the goodness of human nature. You lose your conviction that there's any inherent meaning or purpose to existence. This is nihilism. The recognition that everything you thought mattered might actually be meaningless, that everything you thought was real might actually be illusion, that everything you thought was permanent might actually be temporary. Most people experience this as a crisis to be overcome as quickly as possible. They rush to find new meaning, new purpose, new people to believe in. They throw themselves into work, into relationships, into causes, into anything that will help them forget the terrifying emptiness they glimpsed. But Nietzsche understood that this rushing away from nihilism is actually what keeps people trapped in cycles of betrayal and disillusionment. Because if you don't fully experience the void, you can't fully appreciate what emerges from it. He called this process the transvaluation of all values. The recognition that since there is no inherent meaning in existence, you are free to create meaning. Since there are no guarantees of safety, you are free to choose courage. Since there is no ultimate authority, you are free to become your own authority. But this freedom comes with a price. It requires you to take full responsibility for your life, your choices, your responses to what happens to you. It requires you to stop waiting for someone else to save you, to validate you, to give your life meaning. And this is where betrayal trauma becomes not just a wound, but an initiation. Because betrayal strips away all your external sources of security and meaning and forces you to find them within yourself. It destroys your dependence on others for your sense of self-worth and compels you to create that worth from within. Nietzsche saw this as the birth of what he called the overman. Not a superior person in any conventional sense, but someone who has learned to create their own values, to be their own source of meaning, to love their fate even when that fate includes profound suffering. But here's where Nietzsche's insight becomes truly radical. He understood that this transformation doesn't happen despite betrayal trauma. It happens because of betrayal trauma. The wound is not an obstacle to overcome, the wound is the teacher. Every person who betrayed you was actually serving as an agent of your liberation, whether they knew it or not. They were destroying the false self that needed external validation to survive, making space for the authentic self that draws its power from within. Every illusion they shattered was a prison you didn't know you were living in. Every security they destroyed was actually an insecurity masquerading as safety. Every meaning they annihilated was actually a borrowed meaning that was never truly yours. But Nietzsche also understood something darker about this process. He understood that most people would rather live in familiar suffering than unfamiliar freedom. They would rather remain victims of their betrayals than become authors of their own transformations. Because being a victim gives you someone to blame. It gives you a story that explains why your life isn't working. It gives you an identity, even if that identity is built around suffering. But becoming free? That means giving up the comfort of blame. That means taking full responsibility for how you respond to what happened to you. That means acknowledging that no one else can heal you, save you, or complete you. And this terrifies most people more than betrayal itself. But for those who are willing to walk through the terror, who are willing to embrace the nihilism and allow it to burn away everything false, something magnificent waits on the other side. Not the restoration of their old beliefs, but something infinitely more valuable. The discovery of their own power to create beliefs, not the return of their old meaning, but the recognition of their capacity to generate meaning. Not the healing of their wounds, but the transformation of their wounds into wisdom. This is what Nietzsche meant when he said that what does not destroy you makes you stronger. He wasn't talking about surviving trauma. He was talking about being transformed by it so completely that you become grateful for it. But there's a secret hidden in this transformation that neither Jung nor Nietzsche fully articulated, though both intuited it. The secret that both Jung and Nietzsche circled around but never fully named is this: betrayal trauma isn't something that happens to you. It's something that happens for you. But not in the way the spiritual bypassing crowd wants you to believe. Not in the shallow everything happens for a reason way that minimizes genuine suffering. This is something far more mysterious and far more profound. What if betrayal trauma is actually how consciousness evolves? What if these devastating wounds are actually evolutionary pressures designed to force you into a higher level of psychological and spiritual development? Think about it. Before your deepest betrayal, you probably lived in what psychologists call a kind of psychological fusion. You confused other people's opinions with objective reality. You confused external validation with self-worth. You confused being needed with being loved. You confused security with safety. This fusion isn't just comfortable, it's unconscious. It's a kind of psychological sleep where you drift through life reacting to what others think, feel, and do, without ever developing a strong sense of your own inner authority. Betrayal trauma is the earthquake that shatters this fusion. It forces a kind of psychological separation that would never happen otherwise. When someone you trusted completely destroys that trust, you can no longer afford the luxury of unconscious fusion. You have to develop discernment. You have to learn the difference between your inner knowing and other people's projections. But here's the paradox. The very wound that seems to destroy your capacity for intimacy actually develops your capacity for authentic intimacy. The very trauma that seems to make love impossible actually teaches you what love really is. Because most of what we call love isn't love at all, it's need, it's projection. It's the attempt to use another person to fill a void inside ourselves that can only be filled from within. When betrayal trauma strikes, it reveals this pseudo-love for what it really is, a mutual dependency masquerading as connection. Real love, authentic love, can only exist between two people who don't need each other. Two people who choose each other from a place of wholeness rather than neediness. Two people who can be fully themselves without losing themselves in the relationship. And this kind of love is impossible until you've been forced to find completeness within yourself, until you've been compelled to develop an unshakable sense of self-worth that doesn't depend on anyone else's approval or presence. Betrayal trauma forces this development in a way that nothing else can. It strips away all external sources of validation and security and leaves you alone with yourself. And in that aloneness, if you're brave enough to stay with it rather than running toward the next relationship or distraction, something miraculous happens. You discover that you're enough. Not because you tell yourself positive affirmations, but because you've survived the worst thing you thought could happen to you and you're still here. Not because you've healed all your wounds, but because you've learned to carry them with dignity. This is what the mystics throughout history have called the dark night of the soul. The necessary descent into the underworld of your own psyche, where you confront everything you've been running from. The forced initiation into the mysteries of your own depth. Carl Jung understood this when he wrote about individuation. He knew that wholeness couldn't be achieved through comfort and security. It could only be achieved through the integration of opposites, through the marriage of light and shadow, through the reconciliation of all the parts of yourself that you've rejected or projected onto others. And betrayal trauma forces this integration in a way that nothing else can. When someone you love becomes someone you fear, you can no longer maintain the illusion that people are either all good or all bad. You have to learn to hold paradox. You have to develop what psychologists call cognitive complexity. You have to learn that the same person can genuinely love you and genuinely hurt you. That good people can do terrible things. That your deepest wounds can come from people with good intentions. That love and harm can coexist in the same relationship, sometimes even in the same moment. This isn't cynicism. This is wisdom. This is the development of what Buddhism calls the middle way. The ability to see reality clearly without falling into the extremes of idealization or demonization. Nietzsche understood this too, though he approached it differently. His concept of amor fati, love of fate, wasn't about passive acceptance of suffering. It was about the recognition that everything that happens to you, including the most devastating betrayals, is somehow necessary for your becoming. Not because there's some cosmic plan orchestrating your suffering, but because consciousness itself seems to require these initiations. Because the human psyche seems to need to be broken open in order to discover its own resilience. Because authentic power can only be forged in the fires of authentic powerlessness, But here's where this understanding becomes truly revolutionary. When you recognize betrayal trauma as sacred initiation, you stop being a victim of it and start being a student of it. You stop asking, "Why did this happen to me?" and start asking, "What is this trying to teach me?" You stop trying to heal from it and start trying to integrate it. You stop seeing it as something to overcome and start seeing it as something to embody. You stop running from the wound and start learning to dance with it. This doesn't mean you become masochistic or seek out betrayal. It means you recognize that the betrayals that have already happened were somehow necessary for your evolution, even if you can't understand how or why. It means you stop wasting energy trying to undo the past and start investing that energy in transforming how the past lives within you. It means you stop being defined by what was done to you and start being defined by what you've done with what was done to you. This is the alchemical transformation that both Jung and Nietzsche pointed toward, but never fully described. The transformation of lead into gold, of wound into wisdom, of victim into wounded healer. But this transformation requires something that most people find almost impossible to do. It requires you to find gratitude for your betrayals. Not gratitude that they happened, but gratitude for what they revealed about your own strength, your own resilience, your own capacity to create meaning from meaninglessness. It requires you to recognize your betrayers not as enemies to be defeated, but as unwitting teachers who gave you gifts they never intended to give. The gift of self-reliance, the gift of discernment, the gift of inner authority, the gift of authentic compassion born from genuine understanding of suffering. This is the sacred wound. The wound that doesn't heal because it's not supposed to heal. The wound that becomes a source of power rather than a source of pain. The wound that transforms you from someone who needs to be saved into someone who can save others, not through rescuing them from their wounds, but through modeling how to transform wounds into wisdom. But recognizing your wound as sacred is only the beginning of the real work. The real work begins when you stop trying to heal your betrayal trauma and start learning to individuate through it. Jung's concept of individuation isn't therapy. It's not about feeling better or getting your life back on track. It's about becoming who you actually are beneath all the roles, masks, and identities that trauma taught you to wear for survival. And here's what most people don't understand about this process. Individuation through betrayal trauma requires you to do something that feels completely counterintuitive. Instead of trying to protect yourself from future betrayal, you have to learn to integrate the capacity for betrayal within yourself. Let me explain what I mean. When someone betrays you, your first instinct is to make them the villain and yourself the victim. You split the world into betrayers and betrayed predators and prey, the wounded and the wounders. But this split, however psychologically necessary in the moment, becomes a prison if you stay in it too long. Because the uncomfortable truth is this: everyone has the capacity for betrayal, including you. The part of you that judges your betrayer so harshly is often the same part that's terrified of your own capacity to hurt others. The part that needs to maintain your innocence is often the part that can't face your own shadow. Jung called this shadow integration. The recognition that everything you see in others exists somewhere within yourself, not because you're bad, but because you're human. Not because you will betray others, but because you could, under the right circumstances, with the right pressures, make choices that harm people you care about. This isn't moral relativism. This is psychological honesty. This is the recognition that the line between victim and perpetrator isn't as clear as trauma would have you believe. This is the development of what Jung called the transcendent function, the ability to hold opposites within consciousness without being torn apart by the tension. When you can acknowledge your own capacity for betrayal without acting on it, you develop genuine compassion for human frailty. When you can recognize your own shadow without being consumed by shame, you develop the inner authority to make conscious choices rather than being driven by unconscious patterns. But here's where this gets really challenging. Integrating your shadow doesn't mean expressing it. It means containing it consciously. It means being aware of your capacity for harm without harming. Being aware of your capacity for betrayal without betraying. Being aware of your capacity for cruelty without being cruel. This conscious containment of shadow energy is what creates authentic power. Not the power to dominate others, but the power to govern yourself. Not the power to control external circumstances, but the power to choose your response to whatever circumstances arise. And this is where betrayal trauma becomes your greatest teacher. Because betrayal strips away all your illusions about your own goodness, your own specialness, your own exemption from the darker aspects of human nature. It forces you to confront the fact that you're not different from your betrayer in some fundamental way. You're just human. But recognizing your own capacity for harm also reveals something else: your capacity for choice. If you can hurt others, you can also choose not to. If you can betray trust, you can also choose to honor it. If you can cause suffering, you can also choose to create healing. This is what Jung meant when he said that the shadow, when integrated consciously, becomes your greatest source of creativity and vitality. The same psychological energy that could be used to harm becomes available for healing, creating, loving, and serving something greater than yourself. But shadow integration is only the first step in the individuation process that betrayal trauma makes possible. The second step is what Jung called the integration of the anima and animus, the masculine and feminine aspects of the psyche. Betrayal trauma often creates a split between these energies. You might become overly masculine, hard, defended, controlling, unwilling to be vulnerable, or you might become overly feminine, soft, boundaryless, people-pleasing, unable to protect yourself. Either way, you've lost access to the full spectrum of your psychological resources. The individuation process requires you to reclaim both, to develop the masculine capacity to protect yourself without becoming cruel, to develop the feminine capacity to remain open without becoming naive, to marry strength and softness, power and vulnerability, discernment and compassion. This isn't about gender roles or sexual identity. This is about psychological wholeness. This is about having access to all the tools in your psychological toolkit, rather than being limited to the defensive strategies that trauma taught you. But the final step in the individuation process is the most radical of all. It's what Jung called the integration of the self, the recognition that you are not your ego, not your wounds, not your trauma, not even your healing. You are the awareness within which all of these experiences arise and pass away. This is where betrayal trauma becomes not just a wound to be healed, but a doorway to transcendence. Because when you've been stripped of all external sources of identity and security, when you've been forced to question everything you thought you knew about yourself and others, you have the opportunity to discover what remains when everything else falls away. What remains is consciousness itself, not your personal consciousness with all its stories and identities and wounds, but consciousness as such, the awareness that was present before your trauma and will remain after your healing. The witness that observes all experiences without being defined by any of them. This isn't spiritual bypassing. This isn't transcending your humanity. This is discovering the essence of your humanity, the part of you that can't be betrayed because it exists beyond all relationships, the part of you that can't be wounded because it exists beyond all identities, the part of you that can't be lost because it is the very ground of your being. When you discover this self, betrayal trauma doesn't disappear, but it loses its charge. It becomes just another experience that consciousness is having, rather than a defining event that determines your entire identity and future. And from this place, something extraordinary becomes possible. You can relate to your betrayers not as enemies who destroyed your life, but as fellow travelers who got lost in their own unconsciousness. You can relate to your wounds not as evidence of your brokenness, but as doorways through which wisdom entered your life. You can relate to your entire trauma story not as a tragedy that happened to you, but as a hero's journey that you courageously undertook for the sake of your own evolution and the healing of others who will walk a similar path. This is what it means to become what Jung called a wounded healer. Someone who has transformed their personal suffering into transpersonal wisdom. Someone who has learned to love not despite their wounds, but through them. But becoming a wounded healer requires one final step that most people resist with everything they have. The final step that most people resist is this: you have to forgive your betrayers. Not for their sake, but for your own liberation. But this isn't the forgiveness that spiritual teachers preach from podiums to audiences who nod along without understanding the cost. This isn't the premature forgiveness that bypasses anger and grief and jumps straight to false transcendence. This is the forgiveness that can only come after you've fully felt the rage, fully grieved the loss, fully acknowledged the damage that was done. This is the forgiveness that emerges naturally when you recognize that your betrayers were unconscious. Not excusably unconscious, but tragically unconscious. Trapped in their own unhealed wounds, acting out their own unintegrated shadows, perpetuating cycles of harm that were probably perpetuated against them. When you've done the deep work of individuation, when you've integrated your own shadow and recognized your own capacity for unconscious harm, you can see your betrayers clearly for the first time. Not as monsters, but as wounded humans who never learned how to transform their pain into wisdom. This doesn't excuse what they did. It doesn't minimize the impact of their choices. It doesn't mean you have to let them back into your life or trust them again, but it releases you from the prison of resentment that keeps you energetically connected to them long after they're gone from your life. Because here's what most people don't understand about betrayal trauma. As long as you're holding on to anger and resentment, you're still in relationship with your betrayers. They're still taking up space in your consciousness, still influencing your choices, still determining how you show up in the world. Forgiveness is the final act of individuation. It's how you reclaim the energy that you've been investing in hating them and redirect it toward loving yourself and others. It's how you break the energetic cord that keeps you tethered to the past and step fully into the present moment. But forgiveness isn't the end of the journey. It's the beginning of something entirely new. It's the beginning of your life as a wounded healer, someone who has transformed their deepest pain into their greatest gift. This is where we return to where we started. Remember that devastating pain we talked about in the beginning? That wound that seemed to shatter your entire reality? That betrayal that made you question everything you thought you knew about love, trust, and human nature? That wound was never meant to heal in the conventional sense. It was meant to become sacred. It was meant to become the very source of your power, your wisdom, your capacity to help others navigate their own dark nights of the soul. Every person who will cross your path and recognize something in your eyes that tells them you've been where they are. Every conversation where someone feels safe to share their deepest pain because they sense that you won't try to fix them or minimize their experience. Every moment when your presence alone helps someone feel less alone in their suffering. That's your betrayal trauma working through you as a force of healing in the world. That's your wound transformed into wisdom. That's your pain alchemized into compassion. Carl Jung was right when he said that the wounded healer is one of the most powerful archetypes in human consciousness. The person who has descended into their own underworld and returned with gifts for the tribe. The person who has been broken open by life and learned to let light shine through the cracks. Friedrich Nietzsche was right when he said that what doesn't destroy you makes you stronger. But he wasn't talking about surviving trauma intact. He was talking about being transformed by trauma so completely that you become grateful for it. Not grateful that it happened, but grateful for what it revealed about your own indestructibility. You discovered that you could lose everything you thought defined you and still be essentially yourself. You discovered that you could be betrayed by everyone you trusted and still maintain your capacity to love. You discovered that you could have your reality shattered and still find the courage to build a new one. But most importantly, you discovered that your worth isn't determined by how others treat you. Your value isn't contingent on being understood, appreciated, or loved by anyone else. Your wholeness doesn't depend on finding the perfect relationship or achieving the perfect life. You are already whole. You were whole before the betrayal, whole during the betrayal, and whole after the betrayal. The betrayal just helped you remember this truth by stripping away everything that was covering it up. This is the paradox of the sacred wound. The very thing that seemed to destroy you actually revealed your indestructibility. The very thing that seemed to prove you were worthless actually showed you that your worth is beyond proof. The very thing that seemed to make love impossible actually taught you what love really is. Real love isn't the fusion of two incomplete people trying to make each other whole. Real love is the recognition of two already whole people choosing to share their wholeness. Real love isn't the desperate clinging to someone who might leave. Real love is the generous offering of yourself to someone who is free to go. And you can only love in this way after you've learned to love yourself in this way. After you've learned to be complete within yourself, secure within yourself, at peace with yourself, regardless of who stays or goes, who accepts or rejects, who honors or betrays the gift of your presence. This is what betrayal trauma was always trying to teach you. Not that you can't trust others, but that you can trust yourself. Not that love isn't real, but that love begins with self-love. Not that vulnerability is dangerous, but that true vulnerability comes from strength, not need. The wound that you thought would never heal has become the source of your healing power. The pain that you thought would destroy you has become the foundation of your indestructible strength. The betrayal that you thought would end your capacity for love has become the beginning of your capacity for unconditional love. This is your renaissance, your rebirth, not as the person you were before the betrayal, but as the person you were always meant to become. Not despite your wounds, but because of them. Not in spite of your pain, but through it. You are no longer a victim of your betrayal trauma. You are its grateful student, its conscious alchemist, its wounded healer. You are living proof that the human spirit is unbreakable, that consciousness can transform any experience into wisdom, that love is stronger than pain. And every day you choose to live from this understanding. Every moment you embody this truth, you become a beacon of hope for others who are still lost in the darkness of their own betrayals, still convinced that their wounds define them, still believing that their pain is evidence of their brokenness. Your very existence as a transformed being is their invitation to transformation. Your life as a wounded healer is their proof that healing is possible, that wholeness is attainable, that the wound really can become sacred. If this exploration has opened something within you, if you recognize yourself in these words, if you feel called to dive deeper into the mysteries of consciousness, psychology, and spiritual transformation, consider joining our community of seekers. Subscribe to the channel where we continue to explore the hidden truths that transform suffering into wisdom, wounds into strength, and darkness into light. Your journey of individuation matters, and you don't have to walk it alone.